Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. I'm Stephen.
I'm Daniel.
And today we're going to be continuing our first 500-year series centering on Ignatius of Antioch. We're going to be talking about the passion, specifically, of Ignatius of Antioch. Up to this point, we've talked about his theological import, the impact that he has on the Christian community coming into the early 2nd century. But we really wanted to marinate on his death. You know, you can tell a lot about a man by how he lives, but you can tell even more about a man by how he dies. And Ignatius of Antioch is one of these saints in the early period of the church who just dies well. And so we want to talk about the historical background of the type of condemnation he received, put some context to it, try to get a visual for what this would have looked like for him to go across the empire and then eventually to die in Rome. But then finally, we want to reflect on the import and the trajectory that his death has for the motif of Christian martyrdom up and down the centuries. So, Dan, it's good to get together again. It's been quite a hiatus,
even remotely.
Yeah, we're remote today. Sorry, it's been a little bit of while. It's been a while for us to release an episode, but we're really excited to present this material. So let's just start then with the context, right, of Ignatius's sentencing, because it's pretty clear that he's sentenced in Syria, right, Dan?
Yeah, he's sentenced in Syria, but the big historical question is, well, why is he sentenced? How did this kind of come about? Right. Long ago, the traditional view was that he was sentenced because there was just a general persecution of Christians, and Ignatius is brought forward as a leader of the Christians, and he's tried and then chained up and then sent to Rome to die. But there's a lot of anomalies in there.
Yeah.
And so a lot of scholars in the last century challenged that traditional thesis, and they wanted to say that Ignatius was probably captured or given over because there was an internal church conflict. There was maybe schismatic things going on in the church of Antioch in the east, and the kind of divisions among the Christians spilled over into the streets, and now secondarily the Roman authorities had to get involved, and either they blame Ignatius, or perhaps Ignatius gives himself up in order to kind of bring peace to the whole situation and kind of quell the wrath of the Romans. Is kind of the story. But you know, there's reason to believe, in fact, the most traditional view, that this was some kind of outside persecution, either from the synagogue or the Romans themselves, and we can kind of take a look at that.
Yeah. So there's weird circumstances on that front, but even just in general, it seems like there's just peculiar circumstances in how he's transported, right? Because he's condemned in Syria, he's sentenced at least. Okay, you're going to be thrown to the beasts, but he's paraded to Rome mostly by land. We know that from the letters because he's stopping off at churches, and the churches he's stopping off at, you're like, well, that's not really en route to Rome, because the proper route to Rome from Syria would be mostly actually by sea. So instead, he's going by land, and which is way more expensive. I mean, it's got to be like 3 to 4 times more expensive to go by land than by sea. There's even moments where he's in a port city but doesn't go by sea, and then it's vastly more expensive. Like I said, it's way longer. So the question is, the 10 soldiers that are escorting him, is it possible that maybe they, Ignatius is sort of a tag along to a mission that they were already on, right?
Yeah, because the other anomaly here is it's odd that the Romans are sending him away to be condemned. Mm-hmm. They would have just condemned him in place.
Right.
The only reason why you see, for the most part in the ancient world and in some of the primary sources, the only reason you would see somebody being sent away to Rome after they stood trial was to receive a retrial in Rome, and because they're a Roman citizen.
Right. Like St. Paul.
And they
where St. Paul appeals to Rome. Right.
Right. He appeals to Rome. But we see it elsewhere too. We see it in in Pliny's letters to Emperor Trajan, the governor Pliny in Pontus Bithynia. He's writing about the Christians too. And he says, I let some go to you, to Rome, because they were in fact citizens. But if Ignatius of Antioch was a citizen, the other anomaly here is that he wouldn't have been thrown to the beasts.
Right.
He wouldn't be given over to wild animals. That was a sentence for non-citizens.
Right.
So it's an odd situation we have here with St. Ignatius. But you're right. It seems like this convoy must have been already going to Rome on this route and had perhaps other business on this route. That may make sense also of St. Ignatius being able to take a breath, to dictate a letter, to give it to the churches. Maybe these soldiers are stopping off in certain areas and certain places, visiting certain cities and doing business, perhaps. I don't know. Yeah. We don't know in the letters. But yes, it seems like he's being joined to a convoy.
Yeah, for sure. And just so people realize too that Roman citizens, there were certain ways actually by law that Roman citizens could be sentenced to death. There were certain means by which they could be sentenced to death. We alluded to that, but it's very important. That's why St. Paul has the privilege of being beheaded. I mean, it's the same.
And not being crucified
upside down like Peter, because Peter's not a citizen. Yeah. Paul's Roman citizenship gave him the privilege of being beheaded, which was seen as a privilege in Roman society as a way of being sentenced to death.
Yeah, that was one of the rights of their citizens.
Right, exactly. So that's why when we see just the manner of Ignatius's condemnation, that's how we kind of are tipped off that he's not a Roman citizen. But again, that's why it is bizarre that he's going to Rome. So there's a lot of mystery here, right? There's things that even historians are still debating about the circumstances of this.
Well, yeah, and we only have Ignatius's letters. That's all we have to talk about this situation.
Right.
So it can be ambiguous, and there's going to be mystery to it.
Right. So what we're seeing then with someone like Ignatius being condemned, paraded across the empire to Rome, is that Rome is starting to beginning to notice the Christian movement. You know, they're really starting to see these people, right? And you mentioned Pliny's letter, right? So we're moving out of, in our series at least, we're moving out of that sort of intra-Jewish debate, and we're moving into a realm where Christians are being noticed by the Roman world, the pagan Roman world, and Romans are trying to figure out where to place these people.
Who are these people? Right. So there's an excerpt from Pliny I'll read just to get a sense of it. So again, Pliny is a governor of Pontus Bithynia, a Roman governor, appointed to the area of Asia Minor, where Ignatius actually was. But he says to his letter to Emperor Trajan, "It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. And I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or no difference between very young and the more mature, whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or if a man has once been a Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be one."
He's struggling.
Whether the name,
He's struggling.
Yeah. Whether the name itself, even without offenses, or only the offenses associated with the name are to be punished. So he has no idea how to deal with these Christians. It's clear from his letter that he only has second-hand information about Christians. Mm-hmm. So what year are we in? We're in the early 2nd century, and still there are Roman governors. So yes, Pliny is governor way off in Asia Minor, in the northern part of Asia Minor, but he's from Rome. Mm-hmm. You know, he's a Roman statesman. So you would think somebody like him would have known about the Christians a little more in depth, but he doesn't.
Right.
And he's encountering them really for the first time in his governorship.
Right. So Christians are now on the map. The church is on the map, and the spotlight is on them. But so
yeah, and so now that the spotlight is on them, the Romans have to try and define them.
Yes.
So how do we categorize these Christians? And what you see whether you look at somebody like the Roman historian Tacitus or Suetonius or Pliny himself, all three of those Roman writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries use two words consistently to refer to the Christians. And the first word is haiteria, which means a club or an association. And the second word is superstitio, or superstition. Those are the two words they use for them. And we may think that those are just general terms, but those are terms that actually have specific meanings for Romans.
Yeah, that's like specific classification under Roman law about like which
Right.
religios are licit or illicit in the empire.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the problems. So if we're talking about why was Ignatius handed over, or why is there persecution of Christians? Sometimes it can be because they are grouped as a club, a haiteria, or an association that is illicit, that they're not properly registered, and they're not properly participating in civic things and civic duties, those types of things. And so these clubs at some points throughout Roman history were illegal. We actually hear from Pliny's letter that the Christians stopped gathering for their sacred meals based on an order that was given that no new political clubs, no new heterias can be established. So we see that they were illicit. And so if Christians disobeyed that and kept going to Eucharist or kept gathering together, even though they weren't a properly registered club or association, well, then that could cause condemnation. That could cause persecution on the Christian communities.
Yeah, we're gonna follow up some of these episodes with episodes on Roman religion in general, but it is the point that you're really bringing to light is that it's really hard for us to understand because religion is so privatized in the modern world. It's something that's kind of like it's in your heart, and that's really actually the fruit of a post-Christian context. But and to that point, here's the thing. So why would Romans view Christians as a club? That seems odd to us. Well, because clubs in Roman society, there was no separation of religion from secular things. Both those things happened together. Right.
And when you had a club or an association, these clubs and associations, they weren't like how we would see a guild today, or a what's the word I'm trying to think of? A union. Yeah, they're not like unions or guilds. They are strictly social. They're actually for recreation. And so you had these different types of associations in Roman society. You had professional associations. So let's say a bunch of firemen in the cities wanted to join up and have a club together. They would do that, and they would register that association, and they would use it for helping each other pay for different things. They would host parties, and just recreational kind of support, social support. That they would have. You also had burial societies or funerary societies, helping each other to pay for burying somebody. Now that is important for Christians, okay? Because Christians bury their dead, and sometimes the church couldn't, or sometimes Christians couldn't afford a proper burial of a body, and so Christians were often seen as a burial club. They would pool together their money and help bury their dead. And then the other type of club or association was actually strictly religious, where Roman pagans got together to honor and worship a particular deity that they were drawn to, not excluding others, but focusing on one deity in society, in Roman religion. And so those are the types of clubs. Now, you look at Christians, you say, well, they kind of fall somewhere in between all of those, except Christians are exclusive.
Yeah.
Right. So they could kind of be a registered religious club, but they exclude all the other gods. And so that's where the idea of superstition comes in. If I were to ask you, Steve, what do you think superstition means? Or how do we define superstition in the modern world? What would you say?
Right. It would be like, irrational beliefs, like knock on wood, like don't walk under a ladder, glass mirrors breaking.
Sorcery or magic, or Whatever
Actually,
it might
I
be.
just broke a mirror moving into our new house, and someone actually said to me like, "Oh my gosh, that's bad luck." Like, I don't know. I just gave it. That's a superstition.
Superstitions. Yeah. But yeah, exactly. So that's how our modern ears hear the word superstition. But for the Romans, that was a technical term. Superstitio was a technical term, and what it meant, it was actually a religious category, and what it meant is that those group of people, whoever are the superstitious ones, those people do not practice pietas. They do not have piety. And again, that's another word that we hear differently as moderns. But pietas for the Romans, what did that mean? What did piety mean? Well, piety meant holding on, first and foremost, holding on to the traditions of your family and the traditions of the state that have been time-honored and passed down through the centuries.
Right. It's duty. It's duty to the gods, duty to the state, and duty to family. Those are, I mean, honestly, if you're going to define pietas for the Romans, it is those three components. It's duty to the gods, duty to the state, duty to the family, especially the paterfamilias, the father of the family.
And all that is wrapped up into Roman pietas, Roman piety.
Yes.
And so when you look at the Christians, you have the Romans saying to them, basically, you're not practicing piety. You're not practicing pietas because you're not honoring your family. In fact, you're splitting up families.
Exactly.
You're not honoring the gods because you're exclusive. Okay. So, and you're not taking part in the civic.
You're not honoring the emperor.
Of the state. You're not honoring the emperor.
Exactly.
You're standing aloof.
Right. They're impious.
And so, right. And so the Christians are seen as a superstition. Now, again, who else in the ancient world was labeled as superstitious? The Jews.
Right.
Because again, the Jews had their own religious traditions. But the thing that sets the Jews from the Christians apart, why were Christians being sought out and persecuted more often? It's because they weren't seen as ancient.
They were novel, right?
The Romans saw them as coming up out of Palestine in the first century. At least to the Jews, the Romans could look at them and say, "Oh yeah, well they're ancient. They go all the way back to Moses, and they are honoring their fathers."
Exactly.
And that's what kind of separated. But for the Christians, unfortunately, the Romans see you as a new movement. Even though in our series we've been showing how the early Christians, sometimes more than the contemporary Jews, are carrying on the tradition.
Right, but the Romans are not going to care. Again, the Romans are not going to get down into the weeds about who's carrying on the tradition of Judaism better. That's why they don't care. They see the national identity of the Judeans as something as distinct, and the diaspora Jews as something distinct from what's going on with these Christians. And Christians had this knack for evangelism that Jews did not typically have. I mean, you do have like parts in the gospel where Jesus says like they go, you go through land, over land and sea to make one proselyte, and you make them twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. But there's really not a lot besides that. There's really not a lot of evidence that Jews had a large proselytism like in the Roman Empire, possibly for reasons of what the Christians are going through, because proselytism was a bad thing. Turning a Roman away from the gods, from the state, from the family, was impious. And in fact, it gets to the point even where Christians are considered to be atheists.
That's exactly right. Because Christians and Jews were charged with atheism.
Yes.
Because they're withholding themselves from the civic and public ceremonies of Roman religion. Yes. They are now atheists. Right. That's true. So I do want to. So in the first century, we have the famous Neronian persecution, right? Emperor Nero persecutes the Christians in Rome. This is the persecution where tradition holds that Peter and Paul were killed, right? But in Tacitus's retelling of it, not only does he call the Christians a superstition, but he has this charge against them. He says, quote, "First then, those who confessed membership were arrested. Then on their information, great numbers were convicted, not so much of guilt for the conflagration as of the hatred of the human race." So what he's doing there, he's tying together, he's not saying, oh, Christians hate everybody. What he's saying is that he's tying the word superstition to the hatred of the human race. Because again, superstition is about not practicing public pietas,
Right.
not being a part of your civic duties to the state, to the family, and to the gods. And that's what you find in even the Neronian persecution in the first century.
Yeah. So it's no wonder then why Romans, when they're encountering this superstitio, that they reserve some of the worst punishments for Christians. And in this instance, in the instance of Ignatius, he is condemned to something called damnatio ad bestias. Damnation to the beast, condemnation to the beast. Now, this is something that has existed or had existed in ancient society before Roman society. I think we like think of Gladiator, so we think that like this was peculiar to Rome, but I mean, this goes back. I mean, Daniel in the lion's den. He's thrown to the lions. You have Alexander the Great. There's an episode where Alexander the Great actually had somebody thrown to lions. You have during the Punic Wars, there's all kinds of witness to people being thrown to the beast. So this predates Rome, and in fact, Rome was hostile to this idea for quite a long time, especially as a form of punishment throughout the Republican period. But eventually, it starts to gain popularity as a mere spectacle, where you would have people fighting the beasts in the arena, and then eventually, once you get to the imperial period, like first century BC, and especially when you get to first and second century AD, in the imperial period, that you start to see the building of amphitheaters. Originally, this spectacle happened in the Forum. During the Republican period, but once we get to the imperial period, you start to see amphitheaters designated for things like this. And so it not only is a form of public spectacle, but also a form of condemnation, of punishment for those who Rome would deem as other, right? Because imperial...
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, as others, typically, this kind of condemnation was reserved for instigators of uprisings, for treasonous persons. And if we're talking about Ignatius of Antioch, yes, the church and the Christians in Antioch could be seen as treasonous because they're not giving proper duty to the state and to the gods and to the family.
Yes. So the rise of amphitheaters is actually happening at the precise moment that Ignatius is condemned in this way and sentenced. I mean, you have vast numbers of people. We're talking like 50,000 people descending upon these amphitheaters to see these spectacles.
Yeah. Well, even the great Colosseum in Rome wasn't built until 80. In the year 80 it was finished.
Right. And it was actually built from the spoils of the sack of Jerusalem. So,
yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so damnatio ad bestias is really picking up steam during this time, and really it functions. It's a genius function for Roman society. Look, we live in American society where we have sort of, actually all Western society, we have idolized or idealized the Greco-Roman past, because we've drawn Republican principles and great monuments and all these great things.
Yeah, we see the great ruins, the monuments,
Right.
and we think, oh, how great this society.
The problem with that is that we forget then just how incredibly violent and vile Greco-Roman society was, especially Imperial Roman society is extremely violent. It thrives on violence. I mean, it's almost like being like 2,000 years removed from like the Third Reich and looking back and be like, wow, look at the glory of the Third Reich. It's like the Third Reich was horribly violent though, and it's the same thing here. It's like, because we're so removed in time from it, we forget just how violent
and this is not
was.
Yeah, and this isn't a judgment call on ancient peoples. No. Even Romans themselves, many enlightened Romans themselves, philosophers themselves, didn't like the games.
Exactly.
And they didn't like the slaughter that was going on. But it was, like our own movie industry, a form of entertainment to them.
Exactly. Before you had the cinema, you had the Colosseum, you had the amphitheaters. So it's an ingenious way, because imperial powers by nature, they thrive on the idea of an other, of a them and an us. And that's at the ends of the Roman border. That's what's going on out there. Them, us. You have Roman citizenship and privileges that come along with it. And then there's the them, right? So the amphitheaters almost become a way for the general Roman populace to craft and participate in Roman identity. And that's what the amphitheater is functioning as. You have the recounting of their history, because they would stage great battles of history, the Punic Wars, or they would stage these great battles or hunts. You know, they would bring exotic animals from Africa, from all over the empire,
showing off the stretch of their empire.
Exactly. Yeah. And then when you have this introduction of damnatio ad bestias, this damnation to the beasts, where you're throwing criminals to the beasts, you very much have the idea of a them. Because it was never a Roman citizen that was receiving this punishment, nor was it were they receiving punishments like crucifixion. So there were certain ways of violent ways that Rome would demarcate who's Roman and who's not, who's part of us and who's not. And the fact that Christians are receiving sentences like this very clearly shows us how Romans are seeing Christians. You know, more so than just like the legal classifications, like you're saying, of, you know, superstitio or atheism. It's even more than that when you see, like, they're not Roman. You know, like they're not Romans, and they're not just like an ideological them or an ideological other, right? Because you also have in Rome this patron-client system going on, and wealthy patrons were actually the sponsors of these great games. These public gatherings and spectacles, and the fact that Christians were used as pawns in these games shows you that there was a difference between how Christians described virtue, how to be a man, and how Romans described virtue. Because virtue was something that was very public for Romans. You know, if they did something good, they showed that they did something good. You know, they more so than even the Pharisees when they would bang a gong when somebody would donate money. It was, you know, the Romans would put on a Roman patron would sponsor a great game, and it would be in his name. You know, like all the emperors would inscribe their names on an arch when they won a battle, and they would make sure you knew about it. So, you know, when you come to the Christians were very private about their virtue even. They had a very private view of virtue. Like that comes straight from Christ, where he says, like, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. So the conception... go ahead.
That made it easy for the Romans then to come off with all these different theories about what the Christians are actually like and what the Christians are actually doing in their assemblies.
Exactly.
All the way from eating babies to sacrificing babies to who knows.
That's not a
else.
joke, folks. Eating babies. That was what they were accused of. So yeah, absolutely. And so then using Christians as pawns in these games was a way of also showing that, like, they don't practice virtue. They're not virtuous. They're not civic men. They're private men. They're secretive. And so it was a way of demarcating who is Roman and who is not, but also who is virtuous and who is not. But there's one thing that we have to mention here, and that is that this condemnation of damnatio ad bestias, it actually would take two forms. So you had the traditional damnatio, where somebody was thrown into the arena and either was able to fight with the beast with their hands and lose, or was actually even armed and given armor and given like a sword to fight, or a spear to actually fight with the animal. And it was a losing battle, of course, because, you know, you'd have one animal come out. If the guy's doing a good job, they'd release another one and another one, and eventually the guy would die. So you have, and that's called obicere. So you have damnatio ad bestias, that's condemnation to the beasts, but then you have obicere besties, and this is different. Obicere that's from the Latin to literally cast, to throw. This is where people would be bound, like bound to a stake, bound to a chariot, and literally fed to an animal, where you had no chance of defending yourself or anything. You were literally just put forward as meat for an animal to feed. Now, we actually have a lot of references to this form of punishment in the ancient world. Actually, St. Paul refers to it, right? In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 32, He even says that, if I contend with wild beasts as I had, does he say in Ephesus? I actually don't have the verse in front of me right now, but he says that if I contend with wild beasts and I have, it profits me nothing if I have nothing, if I don't have love. So Paul either actually was condemned. Historians and biblical scholars are actually divided on this, whether or not Paul actually received a damnatio, where he's able to defend himself against a beast and he triumphed.
Yeah, I like that. I like that image
Yeah.
because we sometimes see St. Paul. Actually, we always see St. Paul armed with a sword in his iconography and statuary and everything. Typically, that means the sword represents the Word of God, the two-edged sword, the Word of God. But the idea that Paul might have actually fought off beasts and won is an interesting image.
Right, for sure, yeah. So you have a clear reference to it in the New Testament itself, but you also have Seneca the Younger, Apuleius, Cicero mentions a time when a man was thrown to the beasts, literally just because he obviously not a Roman citizen, but just because he was ugly, they threw him to the beasts because there was just a craze of the crowd. You have Suetonius. He writes about a moment where Caligula actually just sent a bunch of prisoners, regardless of their actual crimes, just sent them to be fed to the animals. Well, so that's obicere, right? Just being bound and just fed to the animals.
Mm-hmm. That's sometimes the right of Roman governors too. I mean, in Pliny again with Christians, he says that before he even wrote to Trajan, he already condemned Christians without even really knowing what to do. He just executed them, and he told the emperor that I executed them because no matter what they're guilty of, they were hard-headed anyway, so they're no good for the empire. And the emperor agreed with him. That's kind of the power of that's Roman Imperium. That's Roman Imperium for sure.
Yeah, and you have Strabo. That's probably would you say that's probably one of the most kind of detailed accounts that we have of damnatio?
I have it in front. It's not detailed, but Strabo writes and says. Quite recently, during the time that we were in Rome, a certain Cellurus, called the son of Aetna, was sent up to the city. He had been the captain of a band of robbers and had for a long time infested the country around Aetna, committing frequent depredations. We saw him torn to pieces by wild beasts in the Forum after a contest of gladiators. And it says he had been set up on a platform fashioned to represent Mount Aetna, where he was from. Which being suddenly unfastened and falling, he was precipitated amongst certain cages of wild beasts, which had also been slightly constructed under the platform for the occasion. So under this platform that was meant to represent Mount Aetna were the caged animals that were then released and tore him apart, according to Strabo.
Cripes. Okay, so you have a lot of textual evidence, or at least references, not very detailed descriptions, but you have references.
Right. Just spotted throughout Roman sources.
Yeah. So there is a lot of imagination that goes into a lot of this. That's why, the movie Gladiator, for instance, when you see the beasts and stuff, there is a lot of imagination that goes into a lot of this with how historians approach it, because there's not a lot of very detailed descriptions. However, we do also have epigraphic evidence. So we actually do have mosaics and depictions of damnatio ad bestias. In fact, there's a mosaic. It's called the Zlitan Mosaic, and it dates to the late 1st and early 2nd century. So now we're at the time of Ignatius. This is literally right when Ignatius is receiving this condemnation. And in this mosaic, you can actually see in two of the panels, damnatio ad bestias and obicere. So you actually see a man who is bound to a stake
in panel 3.
Yes, in panel 3, on a chariot with wheels, and he's being wielded out to a leopard to be eaten. And he has no chance at defense because he's completely tied back. But then right next to him, you have a depiction of a man with a spear who is fighting off a deer who's charging at him. And then just to the right of that, you have a man who's fighting with his bare hands with what appears to be a hyena or a dog or a bear. You can't really tell from the mosaic. And then in the panel just below that, this is really interesting, where you have a man who is stripped naked, and he's being pushed by a Roman, and he's being whipped. With in front of him is a lion, and it's pretty clear that the Roman is whipping not only the man but also the lion to instigate the lion to eat the man. So that's an interesting instance where the man is not bound. In traditional obicere, you'd be bound and fed to the beast, but in this case, this man is just being sort of scooted along and whipped, and the lion is being whipped, and then this lion is coming after him. So there's many manifestations of damnatio ad bestias. I mean, if you haven't gathered that much so far.
Yes, but I would also submit the traditional iconography of St Ignatius.
Yeah.
The traditional iconography of St Ignatius looks very much like that mosaic.
Yes.
The few examples that we're showing,
Yes.
you could see.
Yeah.
So pretty typical depictions of this kind of condemnation, and the Romans knew it well.
Yes.
What it looked
So
like.
out of those two categories of damnatio and obicere, Ignatius makes it pretty clear in the first chapter of his letter to the Ephesians that he has received damnatio, which means that he's going to be able to defend himself against the beasts. This is what he says in chapter 1. I'll read it. For on hearing that I came bound from Syria for the common name and hope, trusting through your prayers to be permitted to fight with beasts at Rome, that so by martyrdom I may indeed become the disciple of him who gave himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God. So that's
what happened. Yeah. So what happened here is that Ignatius already stood trial, so he already knew what he was going to face in Rome.
Yeah.
It's not like he's going to Rome to be put on trial. He knows already. The sentence has been produced, and he's being sent off to Rome.
Exactly.
And so he knows exactly what he's going to be facing there, and he's going to have to fight with the beasts.
right. And from the perspective of a willing Christian martyr, damnatio, see, we would think like, man, I would rather like defend myself against this freaking animal, but for Ignatius and for someone who's set on martyrdom, who's willing to go through martyrdom, damnatio is worse than obicere, because in obicere you are really depicting this like lamb led to the slaughter. There's nothing you could do. I've accepted my sentence. I'm going to be eaten alive by animals. In damnatio, the whole purpose of this was that Romans would laugh at you as you try to struggle to live. It's pathetic, right? That look at this goofball trying to like save his life, and it's inevitable that he's going to die, and he's screaming and trying to like stab at the beasts and stuff. So it's almost like now, on top of knowing that you're going to be gnawed alive by animals, you also have to mentally prepare yourself to know that you're bearing public witness to Jesus Christ around 50,000 people. Mm-hmm. So it's in that context that the martyr has to sort of play the game on top of being martyred. And so that's what we see, right, in the episode with Germanicus, right? There's a great example of that, right?
Yeah, Germanicus. He also lived in the 2nd century. I think you have the quote from Eusebius of Caesarea in his history. He preserves Germanicus's persecution and death.
Yeah. So he actually says that, and they record that the most noble Germanicus especially distinguished himself, overcoming by the grace of God the fear of bodily death implanted by nature, when indeed the proconsul wished to persuade him and urged his youth and besought him, as he was very young and vigorous, to take compassion on himself. He did not hesitate, but eagerly lunged the beast toward himself, compelling and irritating it, in order that he might the sooner be freed from their unrighteous and lawless life. I've always loved this image. I remember, I to be honest with you, the first time I was reading Eusebius' history years and years and years ago, I did actually tear up at this part, because I just imagined this young man, very young, possibly like my age or your age at the time, grabbing this beast and lunging it towards him when he was expected to fight for his life in front of this arena and be laughed at doing it like a pathetic, pawn in a game.
And like you said, this was supposed to be a show for entertaining purposes for the Romans, but the Christians are putting on their own show, and it's the show of this virtue and valor and vigor. And what's the effect of it? Going back to Tacitus's description of Nero's persecution. We read at the end of it, he says, hence, though they were deserving of the most extreme punishment, the Christians, a feeling of pity arose as people felt that they were being sacrificed not for the public good, but because of the savagery of one man. So the Roman people, imagine the effect that these kind of persecutions and condemnations had on the people watching. They're used to somebody, very funny. Okay, he's running around trying to save his life. It's inevitable he's going to die. That's hilarious. But when you see somebody actually giving up their life, willingly, volunteering it, bringing the beast close to them, now the Romans are being reminded of things of their own history. Right? Episodes in their own history of virtuous death. Because virtuous death was virtuous self-giving. Willingly going to your death was a tradition, a strong tradition in Roman society. And so the people watching this thought they were going to get entertainment, and what they were really getting was a lesson in their own virtue.
Yeah, exactly. Because what this is appealing to, when they see these common Christians, maybe in the first few times that they see a Christian die in the arena, like, ha, 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 you know. But when they start to see more and more and more and more, and especially when they start to see premier figures, like leaders of the community, like Ignatius, dying in this way, they're starting to be reminded, some in the crowd are starting to be reminded of their stoic and kind of philosophical values. You know, they're starting to see Christians who are dying apathetically. They're expecting a pathetic show, but they're getting something apathetic. And it's recalling the great heroes of philosophic society, of Greco-Roman society. You have Empedocles, who willingly lunged himself into a volcano to become a god. You have Socrates, who willingly drank the poison, not fearing death. He's like, look, I'm either going to, have a really long nap, or I'm going to be able to go and talk to some of the greatest philosophers who've ever lived, And then you have Cicero, in the Roman context. Cicero, when he was finally at his villa, the soldiers came, it's time to die. He said, I go no further, he says to the soldiers, approach, veteran soldier. And if you can, at least do so much properly, sever this neck.
Yeah, I'm not gonna run anymore. And it's great because you see that exact thing happen with another bishop in the early church, Bishop Polycarp. He's on the run from the Romans, okay? And he's going from house to house. And then finally he just decides, you know what? Enough is enough.
Yeah.
I'm not running anymore. If they want to come and get me and burn me alive or do whatever they want with me, then so be it.
Exactly. So Christians are not pious is what these people keep hearing. They don't show pietas. However, the way that they're dying is showing a kind of piety, that a piety with which we rarely see Romans dying. you know?
Exactly.
And so they're kind of showing.
Imagine the psychological effect of that. Yep.
Yeah, they're kind of just showing their merits in virtue by dying this way. And Ignatius is very sensitive to this. You can see it all throughout his letter, especially to the Romans, where he places a premier importance on him dying in this way for many reasons. It's not just for whatever's going on back in Antioch. It's not just to prove the heretics wrong, right? We've been talking about the Docetists. We've been talking about the Judaizers, right? That's part of it. But there's also this sense of I'm bearing witness to Jesus Christ in front of this violent, debased culture and society.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why we would hold the traditional view of what happened in Antioch. So we would say that what happened in Antioch was some kind of persecution from either Rome or the synagogue or something. Because many times throughout Ignatius's letters, he keeps saying that he's dying for the sake of the name. He keeps saying, for the name, for the name, for the name. He's not saying he's dying because he had to give himself over because there was a schism or there's trouble going on. It's for Christ that he's going to his death. And the only charge could come from Romans. Yeah. Christians wouldn't charge him with dying for the name or he has the name, so let's kill him. It's somebody from the outside that's charging him with having the name, because we know Christians at this time period were persecuted just on account of the name. That's exactly what Pliny says in his letter. He says, should we just kill him because of the name? Because Romans were doing that. Romans were doing that. And so that seems to be why Ignatius is going to his death willingly. It's for Christ himself.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the other part of this too is that it sets, in a way, a trajectory of martyrdom for Christians in the empire, because Ignatius dying in this way, submitting himself. Blessed are the peacemakers. That's what comes to my mind. Blessed are those who stop violence. You know, like that they become the stopping point of violence. And remember that in pagan societies, violence was the way that you gained power, especially in the imperial period of Roman society. Violence, violence is the way that you gain power. These saints, like Ignatius, are showing that it is actually the opposite. The way that you gain notoriety and power is to absorb violence, is to absorb the violence of not only the Romans, but the powers behind the Romans, Satan.
And Ignatius himself says it, that because he's going to absorb the violence, he then will become great.
Yes.
His greatness will be restored to him. His worthiness. He likes to talk about his unworthiness, but it's actually his death that causes him to be worthy.
Yeah.
The Romans would have switched that around. That's not what causes one to be worthy.
Definitely. So as Ignatius sets this example, what you're going to see going forward is that Christians become, as the Epistle to Diognetus, another early 2nd century document says, they become the soul of the world. You know, where it's like just as the body hates the soul and wars against the soul, so the world wars against Christians. But just as the soul loves the body and tries to preserve the body and to make it act uprightly, so Christians try to preserve the world, and they love the world. You're going to see that the church really does become that sponge that absorbs pagan violence. And you'll see, I mean, when we get to the Christ of the 3rd century and all this, I mean, pagan Roman society.
When persecution, well, right, because the persecution right now at this time is sporadic. Right. It's incidental sometimes. Yeah. It's happening here. It's not happening over there. But when we do come to the 3rd century, it's going to be top down.
It's going to be bad.
The Romans are coming for the Christians, and they're starting with the bishops. Yeah. That's where it's going to start.
Exactly. It'll get more and more and more violent. But what you'll see is that because of men like Ignatius sort of setting the tone for the church in the footsteps of the Apostle John, you know, of St. Peter, of St. Paul, they set the tone for the church.
And again, it's important that you're saying that, setting the tone, because look, we're realists. Not all Christians did what Ignatius did. There were a lot of Christians who we know from these letters and from the letters of the Romans too, that ended up sacrificing.
Yes.
Actually, Pliny the governor is one of the first ones we see giving the religious test. So he has some of these Christians, hey, if you offer and sacrifice to the image of the emperor and the image of the gods, well then that means you're not a Christian, you can go free. And he says that some of those Christians did. So not all Christians were as virtuous as Ignatius. But the point is that many were.
Yes. Yeah.
And these stories were written down and preserved by the church as the ideal. That this is who we really are and should be.
That's right.
And that begins to grow in the hearts not only of Christians but also of Romans.
Right. And that's why martyrdom becomes in the conscience of the church. Martyrdom becomes the privileged way of access to the kingdom of God. It really does. Martyrs are on a different plane than the rest of Christians. Yes. And so you're starting to see then the development of the idea of sainthood, the idea of the cult of the saints, is that, well, the martyrs, that's a little different, right? Like, I don't know if you can just see it on the ground, like in the 2nd century, like Christians thinking like, I don't know if I could have done what Ignatius did, you know? Right. So you start to see this, in a good way, a tiering of the church where you have no one equals the martyrs.
Right, and you see it as early as the book of Revelation. We've mentioned that before.
Exactly.
Who's under the altar in the
That's
heavens when the heavens are open and John sees it?
The martyrs.
It's the martyrs who are there. So yeah, that is there, and then that's why you get this down through the centuries when persecution ends, the idea of white martyrdom, that I die daily to myself. And so but the ideal is still martyrdom. There is a martyrdom that goes to
Yes. Yeah. So martyrdom is the privileged way of access to God. So by all counts, Ignatius does indeed get to Rome, and he ends well. He's eaten alive by the beasts to the applause of the crowds. And there's something about like when we were studying this stuff in academia, you'd have your debates between like Protestants and Catholics and Anglicans, whatever, about Ignatius's letters and what does it say about, like, is there a single bishop, is it the Eucharist, all these things. And I always want to bring us back to the point that it's like that's where these letters end. Ultimately, these letters end in this man being devoured alive willingly by beasts when he didn't have to the applause of pagan Roman crowds. That's where this ends. And I'll tell you what, that's theology.